Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm very pleased to be participating in this rollout of a report that JINSA and more importantly, our task force of retired U.S. senior military commanders and legal experts has been working on for the last several months, providing observations and an analysis of the ongoing war in Gaza. I think in particular, with the beginning of the Rafah operation and even controversy as we saw this week about Israeli military operations, their legality, civilian casualties. This is a very timely report. I'm pleased to be joined by four members of the task force this afternoon. General Charles Wald, former deputy commander of U.S. European Command and a distinguished fellow here at JINSA. Lieutenant General David Beidler, former commander of U.S. Marine Forces Central Command. Lieutenant General Tom Trask, former vice commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. And Lieutenant Colonel and Professor Jeffrey Korn, a distinguished fellow with JINSA, a former special assistant for law of war matters with the U.S. Army, and currently the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and the director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University School of Law. In addition, we had on the task force General David Rodriguez, former commander of U.S. Africa Command, and Admiral Michael Rogers, the former commander of U.S. Cyber Command and director of the National Security Agency. The task force traveled to Israel in February for a fact-finding mission, meeting with members of Israel's war cabinet, senior military leadership, IDF commanders and troops who had been fighting in Gaza, as well as representatives from international aid agencies and the United Nations. Very in-depth interviews, but also in the weeks and months that followed, a lot of discussion and research by the task force, arriving at their findings and observations that are contained in the report that you can find on our website at jinsa.org. So with that, I wanted to ask the task force members to tell us briefly about their findings and observations in the report. I have some questions to ask them to delve a little deeper. And then the last 15 or 10 minutes of the hour, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. If you do have a question for our panelists, you can submit it in writing using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and then I'll pose those questions to the task force members. So let's go ahead and begin. If I could ask General Wald, if you could share with us sort of an overview of the report background and sort of why you thought it was important to participate in this project.
Thank you, Blaze. Thanks, team members, for being here, and thank everybody that's listening to the webinar today. JINSA has been involved with this type of activity over the years, as you'll hear from the teammates a little later. But it's not unusual for JINSA to take on these very complicated activities and provide an unbiased report, at least from our viewpoint. As Blaze alluded to a minute ago, this has been probably the most scrutinized combat operation in recent memory, and highlighted recently by the Monday strike in Rafah that had dozens of civilian casualties, which just re-emphasized the complexity of this process. The intent of the team was to do a couple things, but primarily to enlighten, hopefully, or at least provide insights for U.S. national security policymakers as we go forward in the future for U.S. forces, but all forces that are allies to the United States. This particular combat operation is probably, I wouldn't say probably, it is unique I'd say in the history of combat, and you'll hear a little more about that later, but I wanted to make sure that national defense policymakers understood exactly how this was going down from a military operational standpoint and operational decision making, and to inform these national security decision makers of what people are getting into when you get into a situation as we're witnessing in Gaza today. The Hamas-Israeli conflict is complicated by virtue of the fact that Hamas is sponsored by Iran, and Israel sits in an axis of fire, basically surrounded by belligerent enemies that would like to see them go away. So it isn't just Gaza they're having to contend with, but they have to also contend with the fact that there's Hezbollah to the north, which has purportedly, and I believe it, up to 150 to 200,000 rockets and missiles available at the behest of Iran if they need to. So that's a lesson for us from the standpoint of collateral, and also from the standpoint of partnerships and the importance of partnerships and alliances. But we wanted to make sure that military leaders realized that, not realized, but had insights into what again, I think is probably a very unique and probably the first time in history that a battle has been fought in multi-dimensions here: air, land, under the ground, and from an information standpoint. And U.S. military leaders can learn a lot from that. I would say that, again, in history, this battle that's being fought in Gaza right now with the underground tunneling up to 500 miles purportedly is a one-time, at least the first time in history it's ever been fought that way. So our insights have been valuable, but I would leave it at that, and then I'll make a couple of comments toward the end. Thanks, Blaise.
Thank you, General Wald, and let me underscore that the purpose of this report was to bring military experts to really look at military operations being conducted by the IDF and Hamas in this war. We didn't sort of ask the question of what happens when the fighting ends, although JINSA has conducted a study of what the day after in Gaza could and should look like in collaboration with the Vandenberg Coalition, and I commend that to all of our listeners to take a look at on our website if you'd like to. Nor did it ask questions about U.S. policy toward this war. It's merely focused on what is happening on the ground. But we also learned that it's hard to think about and understand what is happening on the ground without looking at some of the strategic context. And maybe to talk about that, let me turn it over to General Beidler.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dave Beidler. I'm a retired Marine. Thanks for your time and attention this afternoon. Let me try to put a little bit of this in context. And for myself, I was fortunate enough to have traveled with JINSA to Israel back in June of 2023. There were a total of 10 general and flag officers, all at the 3- and 4-star rank, that traveled there at that time. It's an annual event that JINSA sponsored. And from that time period, June of 2023, to the attack on 7 October, only 4 months later, it was especially shocking what transpired that day for those members who were on that trip with me. And even having read about the attack and summoned the strength to endure the 47-minute bearing witness video of the attack as presented at the Israeli embassy by invitation in D.C., it really all came home to me, seeing firsthand what the aftermath was, both physically and emotionally, in February of 24, when our task force went back into Israel to take a look at what transpired militarily in Gaza since. It was clear to me through those observations that Hamas was trained, equipped, and motivated to kill and violate as many Israeli civilians as they possibly could, and they left Israeli citizens that survived the attack forever shaken. But beyond the carnage it caused on that day and the immediate days after, the savage attack really shook the foundation of Israeli society, Israeli security, and left many Israeli citizens, again, questioning their security, questioning the ability of the Israeli Defense Force to provide that security, and shook them to their core. Israelis we met with in February were all impacted in one way or another. As I mentioned, their sense of security was damaged, if not shattered in some cases. Their faith in the IDF was challenged. Those close to the Gaza border The kibbutzes that were attacked and those to the north on the Lebanese border, as General Wald mentioned earlier, were most shaken. We met many of those displaced Israelis in the hotel that we happened to stay in February. In previous rounds of fighting between Israel and Hamas may have temporarily degraded the terrorist group's capabilities, but it certainly did not deter it, calling into question Israel's previous approach to dealing with that threat. And Hamas has not been the only threat, as was mentioned, to Israel since October 7th. And in fact, they continue to attack Israeli citizens since then. But Iran and their proxies have encircled, and attacked with Lebanese Hezbollah, foremost among them, armed with missiles, rockets, and RPVs and the like. But as you'll see, the focus of our report here is to provide additional clarity to U.S. policymakers and defense leadership as to what has transpired since militarily in Gaza, help them better appreciate all that the IDF has dealt with and achieved since that operation began. I'll turn it back over to Blaise.
Thank you, General Beidler. Let me ask General Trask to now tell us a little bit about what we learned about operations and tactics, both how the IDF and Hamas are fighting on the ground.
Thanks, Blaise, and thanks for everybody for joining us today. A big part of our focus for the task force each time that we do one of these type of events is on what are the operational lessons learned. And so a lot of our focus was on the operational aspects, both of the IDF and how they conducted this activity versus previous ones, but also specifically about Hamas and how Hamas was organized and set up to fight. And in this case, since this conflict started with a Hamas assault inside Israel, it really creates a very different operational environment than was ever addressed before by the IDF, or at least since they've come out of Gaza 20 years ago, when the Israeli military left in the first place. The environment there is also very different even than it was 20 years ago when the Israelis still occupied Gaza, in that it is now the most difficult, dense, urban combat environment that you can imagine. It has been built by Hamas for the past 20 years into a complete fortress, and the extensive underground infrastructure makes it extremely unique, even compared to urban environments that U.S. forces have participated in the past. Hamas basically took 20 years to build fighting positions and to build this huge underground infrastructure. At the same time, Hamas was building itself, and it was much more of a terror army than we had ever, or at least that I had ever envisioned as far as the organization of the forces. They were organized in battalions that had regional areas of responsibility, right down to city blocks that were one battalion or another. They had training and recruiting and all of that built in like a conventional army. However, they operate like a terrorist organization. They don't wear uniforms. They don't identify themselves as combatants. They do target primarily civilian Israeli targets, and they hide behind Palestinian civilian targets. So the way they operate is purely terrorist, but the way they're organized and trained and equipped is much like a conventional fighting force. And we thought that was very interesting because it created a specific number of problems for the IDF when they entered. Building that fortress over 20 years, that infrastructure was extremely widespread and intense, consisting of tactical tunnels that were near the surface that provided for lines of communication and transportation for Hamas operators, and then deeper, more strategic tunnels that included things like munitions storage areas and munitions factories, full up munitions factories operating underground, in addition to training areas and weapons caches that were across the entirety of the Gaza area. Above ground, almost every building that the IDF went into was in some way a fighting position, either contained weapons or munitions or some other support capability, whether it was communications or medical. Almost every facility that the IDF would go into, this included homes, schools, mosques, hospitals, and even UN offices in many cases, were fighting positions. This allowed Hamas to move on the ground, on the surface, without wearing uniforms, without having to carry weapons, without having to carry military gear, because they knew all they had to do is move from one fighting position to another to continue the operation. So you can imagine the operational difficulty this provides for a ground force moving into Gaza this time, where the enemy is underneath you, can pop up behind you, and can move freely underground. The challenges are immense. The IDF has managed to put together an air power, indirect fires, and ground forces in a very cohesive way to operationally dismantle those Hamas battalions one at a time, from the north to the south. At the time that we were there in person in February, Gaza City had largely been completed, and they were focused on the central areas of Gaza. Of course, now they're to the point where most of those battalions in the central and the north have been at least militarily dismantled to some extent, and they're focused on those 4 battalions that are remaining in Rafah, probably reinforced battalions with survivors of the central and northern areas. So that's going to be even a more difficult and robust fight. But their military successes from an operational perspective are extremely impressive. The ways that they learned how to track Hamas operators, how to use dogs and drones inside the tunnels, how to dismantle the tunnel situation, the tunnel infrastructure, so that at least if you couldn't destroy it all, which would just take too long and too much, they could close off ends of tactical tunnels and make them unusable by understanding how that tunnel system was being used by Hamas. So from that perspective, operationally, the IDF has been very successful in dismantling that Hamas infrastructure to a large extent, while at the same time having very robust procedures in place to try to mitigate civilian casualties along the way. And you can imagine the difficulties of trying to do that in a situation where Hamas is trying to do exactly the opposite, which is to use the civilian infrastructure, use the refugees and the civilians to hide behind. It makes that challenge for the IDF even that much greater. I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned. Some of those are in the report for U.S. forces in the future, because this is probably not the last time that we will face a situation like this, even from a U.S. force perspective. So with that, I'll hand it back to Blaise.
Thank you, General Trask. And you mentioned both the IDF commitment to trying to mitigate risk to civilians, but the difficulty of doing so in the environment that Hamas has created in Gaza. So I wanted to invite Professor Korn to weigh in on some of the legal aspects of this conflict and what we should know both about Israeli behavior and commitment to the law, to following the law, and how Hamas does so as well.
Thank you, Blaise. Thank you, gentlemen, for the opportunity to participate, and thank you for everybody who's listening. It is self-evident that the legitimacy of this military operation has been largely dictated by the perception of respect for international law by the Israeli forces. There's been a pretty much complete waiver of expectation of that respect by their enemy. Nonetheless, the widespread criticism of Israel has largely been driven by what I believe is misunderstanding of what the law provides and misunderstanding of the nature of the operation in which the law is applicable. So in the report, we really focused on 3 main points related to the law, international law. The first is the broad question of how military commanders translate the national right of self-defense into a military operational plan, because that's the core of the initial criticism of Israel. They were too heavy-handed in their response. And our view, certainly my view, was that is largely driven by a widespread misunderstanding of the true nature of the Hamas threat. As General Trask noted, this was not a group of terrorists loosely organized throwing Molotov cocktails. This was a 35 to 40,000 strong enemy armed force that had years to create improved battle positions anticipating this operation. And the scale of the military action that was initially conducted was pretty surprising to me, and I think to some of the other members. 100,000 combat maneuver forces, 5 divisions conducting a simultaneous ground combat operation against Hamas. At its most basic terms, Israel had a right to defend itself. But for military commanders, that has to be translated into operational objectives. So what the report tries to explain is that you can't just say Israel has a right to defend itself. What you have to do is ask the question, in order to achieve that goal, what does the military commander have to achieve? If you were the chief of the IDF and the prime minister said, what do we need to do for our people to be safe to live along the border? The answer seemed pretty clear. Prior efforts to deal with Hamas with much more limited and restrained self-defense actions had proven ineffective. And so the decision was made to do what combat forces are designed to do. Use fire and maneuver to close with and destroy your enemy as efficiently as possible. So in our view, the scope of the operation, the scale of the operation was completely consistent with the nature of the ongoing threat and the inherent right of the nation to defend itself against that threat. The next issue we looked at was implementation of law in the execution of those combat operations. And as General Trask noted, that is an intensely challenging proposition for any armed force, much less an armed force that's composed largely of conscripts and reservists that have been called up very quickly. And it's a real challenge of leadership, I think, when you're fighting an enemy that has no respect for the law, doesn't care about your civilians, doesn't care about your detainees, doesn't even care about his own civilians, to demand of 18 and 19-year-olds that we are going to follow rules no matter what the situation brings to force. And in my view, this is one of the great distortions of the narrative of the war, the distortion that the Israelis are systemically indifferent to their obligations under international law to mitigate the risk to civilians, to help civilians who are suffering in the combat area. From what we saw, that's simply not true. Now, are there situations where there have been some violations of the law? Of course there are. Any military lawyer in the United States who's been involved in a military campaign would say that no military is perfect. Our own forces make mistakes. Our own forces have bad actors. What matters at that point is whether or not there's a commitment of the institution to investigate those incidents and hold people accountable. And that process is ongoing in the Israeli Defense Forces. And in fact, the structure of the Israeli military legal department is even more independent from the chain of command than US military lawyers are. And so there's no question in our mind and in our view that from a systemic level, the Israeli Defense Forces are committed to respecting their obligations under international law in the conduct of military operations. But there is misunderstanding of what that law requires. The law is not designed exclusively to protect civilians from the suffering in war. Because if that were the function of the law, it would incentivize the illicit activity of enemies like Hamas. The law is designed to balance the legitimate need of the commander to achieve the military objective through the use of combat power with the effort to mitigate as much as feasible the suffering that's inflicted as a result of conflict. And when we analyzed it from that perspective, the measures that Israeli commanders implemented to mitigate risk, to call off attacks, to warn civilians, to create areas that were safer than other areas of active combat, in our view, were all manifestations of a good faith commitment to the same rules that we would demand our commanders to comply with in military operations. And, you know, we talk about lessons learned, and there's another kind of audience of lessons learned from this conflict, and I think that's future enemies of the United States and other democracies. And the lesson is, if we can create the perception that your armed forces are completely indifferent to the suffering of the human population by setting the conditions so that the only way you can attack us is to inflict civilian casualties, by using human shields, by distorting the actual numbers of casualties, by treating every casualty as a civilian casualty, it will inevitably lead to a backlash against those forces, and that will be ammunition in our information campaign arsenal. So the distortion of both what the law requires, but I think more importantly, how the law actually functions in a complex, high intensity, combined arms maneuver operation has been one of the real negative consequences of this campaign, and one that US forces and NATO forces better be cognizant of, because their future fights are not going to be counterinsurgency fights like Afghanistan. They're going to be high intensity fights against capable enemies who know how to manipulate facts and information to create a perception of lawlessness and indifference. And the last piece of this is related to that, and that is understanding how the IDF responded to an enemy that is completely indifferent in its military or its legal obligations. And the good news is that the IDF did what we expect any professional military to do. They recognize that even if your enemy is not going to comply with the law, that in no way releases you of your obligation. And ironically, in many cases, increases your obligation because you're the only party to the conflict that's going to mitigate the risk to the civilian population that is the victim of the entire campaign. Having said that, I think we have to be clear-eyed that if we allow an enemy like Hamas to use civilians and civilian casualties as ammunition in a disinformation campaign, it will inevitably result in a neutering of the commander's ability to execute combat operations efficiently and effectively. And you can scratch your head a little bit and even look at what's happening in Rafah. I mean, this has been a slow crawl. This has been dragging on for a long time. And we know why, because Hamas has embedded itself in that densely populated refugee area and is basically baiting the IDF to come and get them. And so the pressure on the IDF based on civilian casualties has caused a lot of hesitation and a lot of reticence in executing that operation efficiently and effectively. And in the long run, that might actually be counterproductive for the reconstitution of Gaza into some type of entity that is better for both the Israeli population and the Gazan population itself. Lots of issues related to the law. The basic conclusion is Israel understands its obligations. The campaign was justified as an action of self-defense, and the Israeli Defense Forces systemically respect their obligations under international law. And as a result of that, civilians who Hamas was ready to sacrifice have actually often been spared. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Korn, for, as always, laying complicated legal issues out so clearly. We've talked about how the IDF has fought, how it complied with the law, but General Beidler, if I could turn to you again to talk a little bit about the strategic piece of this. What is the IDF trying to accomplish? What are Hamas trying to accomplish? How successful are they being?
Thank you, Blaise. You know, I'm not sure we know precisely what the strategic objectives were for Hamas in the 7 October attack. There are many theories, but there is no doubt that whatever their strategic aims were, they were going to be information driven, as you just have heard from the previous presenters. And in the case of Hamas, largely disinformation driven, all with the intent to end IDF operations quickly before Israeli strategic aims are achieved, before reasonable security of Israeli citizens in Israel is set, and ultimately on terms favorable to Hamas. All with Hamas's consideration for the impacts on the people of Gaza of little or no concern to them. What we have seen, what we observed in our time in February and since, is the IDF has operated in a very demanding environment, a very complex environment, with tactical and operational excellence, with a broad and somewhat unclearly defined objective of destroying Hamas. Words mean things, especially words that define military objectives. And we have heard many different terms used. Destroy is the one that is most used, but we've heard other terms thrown about: defeat, dismantle, neutralize, the list goes on. And each of those words, unless very well defined in military doctrine, some are not as well defined, probably requires a little bit more of the "by that I mean" from higher leadership, typically civilian leadership. But each has its own requirements in terms of what is required to achieve that outcome, and each comes with a list of resources required to achieve that level of thing relative to the enemy or the environment. Those resources are people, material, and time. And this has been ongoing for some time because the task given to the IDF was a daunting one in that environment against that enemy. And what we've seen is they've operated exceptionally well with that daunting task. Now, linking that tactical and operational excellence, the IDF has had tactical victories that linked together would support military operational objectives. And ideally, those military objectives being accomplished would set conditions for a whole of government strategic outcome. Defining that desired outcome has been elusive. Much has been said about the day after in Gaza. Some have suggested that it's too early to set that, to articulate what a day after in Gaza looks like. I would disagree with that. The Israeli Defense Forces need an aim point for their military operations, for the military operations to set the conditions for a desired strategic outcome. So in any case, a clear vision of the day after in Gaza remains elusive. And as a result, there are a number of things that could be done. Some could be done a little bit differently that would be required to set those conditions to ensure that the strategic outcome, the desired strategic outcome, as a result of the military tactical and operations successes is achievable. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But the bottom line is there are things that you've got to do in concert with the military operations in order to set a grander strategic outcome. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, General Beidler. And then to maybe wrap up this section of the overview of the report, let me turn to General Wald, because one thing that I think everyone has talked about so far is the importance of perception of information in this war. So General Wald, if you could give us a little bit of insight into how the task force sees those information operations on each side working.
Yeah, thank you. And those are really insightful comments by the team. A few years ago, we visited Israel after on one of these visits during, I think, a minor conflict in Dasta. And one of the things we observed is that the Israeli Defense Force did not have an official spokesman, if you will. And they subsequently have had that, and they've had some pretty good spokesmen for this activity as well. But a large, significant part of any battle, and this one particularly, is the hearts and minds of the people observing the conflict and outside pressures from those individuals and organizations. And I think retrospectively, the Israelis will do a eventual, and they probably have been doing it already, but a hot wash here to develop lessons learned from the standpoint of not just how they operationally employed themselves, and that goes all the way from pre-intel to intel during the operation to operational activity during the conflict and then afterwards, but one of the issues that we found previously and we found again is that telling the story, if you will, and that sounds kind of trite, it isn't a story, it's factual, is one of the most difficult things you have to do. And again, I would personally commend the Israelis for giving it a real good shot this time with spokesman for what's happening during the conflict. But U.S. military has gotten into the habit of, if you're in a conflict, they have a spokesman on a daily basis, military person, and sometimes a civilian, that gives a daily update of what's happening. And I believe that that would be very helpful. I mean, I think most of us on here and probably people that are watching this watch the news on Gaza on a daily basis and try to get as much information as they possibly can. And most of that's done by news media. And that's good. That's okay too. But the story itself, and I think Jeff really articulated it well, is a very complex story. And you know, whoever has the mic wins a lot of times. And in this case, you know, Hamas, again, has no compulsion about telling the truth whatsoever. I think it would be accepted that they don't tell the truth, but it's a story that is compelling. You see pictures of suffering civilians, and it's always the Israelis that have caused it. I haven't seen it except for the film that Dave talked about early on, the 47-minute film, which is really horrendously telling. And the majority of people haven't seen it because it really isn't released to the public. But that type of story, it sends chills through you when you see it. And it starts putting into perspective why this combat activity is going on and what's happening, how difficult it is. And again, going back to Jeff's point, how professional the Israeli military has been. We've all been in combat. We've all had combat leadership positions. Every once in a while, somebody does something either stupid or even sometimes rarely malicious. And that clouds the whole activity of what's going on. I mean, those are the type of things that the Israeli military has to be out front with immediately, as soon as they know the facts, but right away. So again, I think a lesson that has been learned by the Israelis, but probably needs to be even better executed, if you will, is the information campaign. There's also a political side to that, and we're not going to get involved in that. But I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have a credible spokesman that knows exactly what's happening, has access to inside information, understands where the limits are, what can be released, and is able to tell the story in a very compelling and credible way, how important that is.
Blaze, can I just make a quick comment to tag on to the general?
Please.
I think one of the things that we recognized is that in this environment, and it's probably something similar the US will face in the future, there's a phenomenon of what I've called mistake magnification. So General Wald says mistakes happen in war. We know that, but there's this expectation they shouldn't happen. I was looking at some of the questions, and one of the questions was, you talk about how precise the Israelis are, and yet they blow up a refugee camp. Well, I mean, we can debate whether or not they were attacking a refugee camp accidentally, but mistakes happen in war, even by the very best militaries. I remember after one incident, I can't remember the exact incident, but there were a number of civilians killed. There was a retired US admiral on the news who said, this would never happen in the US military. And I'm thinking, I was involved in the investigation of Kunduz. I mean, and if you read that CENTCOM investigation, you would see that it was a tragedy of errors and mistakes that all coalesced to produce a terrible outcome that nobody wanted to inflict. So the point.
Can you say a little bit about what the Kunduz incident was, just for
The
context?
Kunduz was when the United States accidentally targeted the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, because there was confusion between the joint forward air controller on the ground communicating with the gunship in the air, and they mistook it for an enemy strongpoint. But the point that General Wald makes about the Israelis doing better about being rapid and out front with a trusted and credible spokesperson is so important to manage the reaction to those type of mistakes. Otherwise, the first report from the battlefield, which is almost always wrong, becomes definitive, and then it becomes evidence of legal and moral indifference, and you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. And I think that's one of the really important lessons from this study.
Thank you. So I have a long list of questions I want to ask the task force, but I'll whittle them down here and try to get to audience questions in the next 5 or so minutes. So if you do have any questions, feel free to please submit them using the Q&A feature. Let me ask first whether there was anything about this conflict that in the process of putting together the report or in our travels to Israel surprised you, or you feel is still not well understood or should be understood better here in Washington. Go ahead, General Beidler.
I think the one thing that was most telling in our trip in February was the density of the tunnels in Gaza, the complexity of the tunnels in Gaza. 2 levels, one tactical, one strategic. Tactical just below the surface, where we witnessed in video Hamas operatives crawl through very small holes in a tunnel, step up on the surface, attack a armored vehicle, and jump back down through that hole before they could be detected. With strategic tunnels much deeper in the ground, from which all of this was orchestrated. 300 miles of tunnels in Gaza. That was the thing that was most pronounced in all of the discussions that we had at the military and tactical level.
Thanks. Any other thoughts, Professor Korn?
For me, it was the scale of the enemy threat. Now, part of that may be my instinct, because I started my career as a tactical intelligence officer, but I was shocked at how capable this enemy was. It relates to what the general said, it relates to what General Trask said. And those strategic tunnels weren't just command and control facilities. They were logistics points, weapons manufacturing capability, maneuver capability. And so, talk about messaging. When we talk about fighting a terrorist enemy, I think one of the things we came away with was that creates a false impression that it's a real mismatch and your use of force is excessive. I don't think that was the case at all. I think that the Israelis, it was through their tactical excellence and their maneuver that they outwitted the enemy. But if they had done what the enemy expected, it would have been a much more gruesome fight against this capable enemy. So the nature of the threat, I don't think it still is well understood, even what's left over.
Thank you. Let me direct this first to General Trask, but then invite the rest of you to weigh in. In talking about the IDF operations, General Trask, you sort of talked about how unique or specifically complex this battlefield was. But you also said that there are lessons that can be drawn from it for future U.S. conflicts. Can you elucidate both what you think might be new and different about this conflict, but what might be applicable to what the U.S. military has to prepare for?
Sure, Blaze. And one of the things I was referring to earlier was I worked on the 2021 Gaza assessment that we did from the 11-day. What was mostly a rocket fight back and forth. It was air power from the Israeli side. It was rockets and indirect fire from Hamas, where the operation was completely different. Israel had no plans to go in on the ground. It was simply the objectives were completely different. There was no attempt to eliminate the influence that Hamas had on the people inside Gaza. It was simply an effort to try to reduce the number of rockets that were available for future attacks. And the same thing had happened in 2008, 2014. It was, we referred to it as mowing the grass. Every few years, Israel would have to try to degrade that capability. And it actually, my thoughts on the first question are tied into this. The thing that really surprised me when I got there was the effect of October 7th on Israel and the Israeli people. The willingness to call up the entire reserves, how thin their small population even though everybody serves in the military or such a large percentage do, that the need to call up reserves for this, while at the same time having to reserve a northern border and to be concerned about a threat from Iran at the same time, this becomes a truly existential issue for them. They had a generation of Israelis that were raised under this threat of rockets coming across, of burning kites being sent in to burn fields, so that the young people in Israel are just used to it. So it surprised me when I got there how much this particular event shook them. And it's why that it became obvious to us why the objective had to change. It had to be the elimination of Hamas as the ruling organization, as a fighting force inside Gaza this time. Really that was the big difference from the previous fights. The lessons taken, I think, can be very tactical ones about how to fight in tunnels, how the enemy was able to use the tunnels, but how the Israelis were able to counteract the use of those tunnels and to destroy tunnel systems or make them ineffective. Specifically, it was the use of drones versus canines. I thought was one of the most interesting things I saw, where there were times when you wouldn't want to use the dog to go in and trigger the booby trap, you would want to use the drone. There were times when the dogs would go in, knowing that they would stop when they got to, when they sensed that there was explosives in the area. And so those tactical lessons, I think, are ones that we can translate over directly to U.S. forces. But from an operational perspective, it's understanding what Hamas did and building that infrastructure that Dave and Jeff were both just talking about. And look at that's going to be the type of enemy we may have to fight in the future.
Hey, Blaze, can I make one comment?
Please jump in, General.
First of all, it's really insightful from General Trask and Badler and Korn as well. But one of the things that isn't going to be in the report, and it's just the way it was timing wise, but and hasn't been mentioned much, but is the defense Israel and the coalition had against the Iranian missile attack, which is a huge part of this whole thing as well, from many perspectives. One is the fact that Iran actually attacked Israel for various reasons, but in a very, 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 I guess, failed way, if you will. And it goes back to again, it's a very difficult fight in Gaza. There's no doubt about it. I wouldn't wish that fight on any combat commander. It can't be any harder, I don't think. But the missile attack was more traditional, more of what we've come to see in the past, if you will, in more conventional wars. And the fact that Israel was able to defeat all but just a couple of those ballistic missiles with the coalition is massively important for the future for combat around the world for us and for in the Middle East with the Israelis. But it's also a testament to the coalition and the technology that's available. That won't be in the report, but it'll come out eventually as one of the major issues of this whole conflict, is that it was a one-time attack. It was an embarrassment for Iran, a total failure, and it was a significant success by the coalition in Israel. And that's a positive occurrence. It's kind of been, oh, by the way, no big deal, but it's a huge deal.
Thank you, General Wald. So let me start turning to some of our audience questions here, maybe combining them with some of my own. For Professor Korn, I wanted to ask you how your legal findings, the task force's legal findings in the report, compared to the State Department report that was released several weeks ago, looking at Israeli compliance with international laws. And specifically on that, we had one of our participants, our attendees, ask whether the task force looked into any potential Israeli violations of the law. Did we identify any systemic failures?
So it's interesting. I think if you read that State Department report, which, by the way, is limited to whether U.S. defense articles have been used in a manner inconsistent with international law, it's largely aligned with the findings of our report. That report was widely misrepresented in the media because they took one sentence out of context that said there's reason to believe that there may have been uses in violation of international humanitarian law. Well, you could say that about U.S. operations too. There's never a perfect operation. What the report said in context was the State Department concluded that as a systemic matter, the IDF complies with its obligations under international law, that complying with your obligations doesn't mean you should stop trying to figure out ways to improve your operations, particularly in the realm of precautionary measures to mitigate civilian risk. We said the same thing. And we saw an upward trajectory, a tactical evolution of methods to reduce civilian risk. For example, we spoke with one division commander who said, if you look at the physical destruction in Gaza City and you compare it to Khan Yunis, it's less in Khan Yunis because by the time we got to Khan Yunis, we were more confident in our ability to clear buildings without using firepower to destroy them initially. That's a positive evolution of tactics that put IDF soldiers at risk for the purpose of reducing collateral damage and incidental injury. The State Department report also concluded that Israel has complied with its obligations related to humanitarian access. We made the same conclusion, but like the State Department report, we also acknowledge that there's more to be done, and complying with the law doesn't always mean you've achieved your strategic goal, and that it would have been, perhaps in hindsight, which of course is easy, it would have been wise to be a little bit more aggressive in facilitating humanitarian access and stability early on in the operation. So I think the report actually was pretty good. But if you just look at that one headline, you would think that the State Department dropped, an atom bomb on Israel, accusing it of pervasive violation of the law of war. And then finally, the report emphasized over and over again that Israel is fighting an enemy that pervasively violates international law, specifically by using human shields and creating conditions where the only way that their assets can be attacked is by placing civilians at risk, which is the most outrageous violation of the law.
Thanks, Professor Korn. Maybe building off of that last observation that there's a big difference between what the State Department report actually said and how it was reported, I could combine several questions that have been asked about the information piece of this war. Someone commented that it feels like the other side is winning the PR campaign. What can be done, if anything, to correct this concerted wave of misinformation? And someone else asked or suggested whether it would make sense for Israel to take legal action against news outlets or social media companies to force them to take down false or misleading posts. Any ideas on what more can be done to fight this information campaign?
Well, one thing I'd say is projects like this. So for the audience, consider this. How many opportunities have you had to have a critique of the military campaign in Israel conducted by professionals who've engaged in leading military campaigns, as opposed to, pundits who assume they understand what war is like, or maybe don't understand the true nature of what's happening on the ground? I think the other piece, it goes right back to what General Waltz said about having a very pervasive presence. I mean, I think of General Schwarzkopf in the first Gulf War. Every day, the commander of the operation found the time to get in front of the media. It wasn't delegated to just some junior officer. It was the leader of the organization, the one that was accountable for what was happening. So enhancing the flow of information and the delivery of information. But the truth is that there's some of this battle can't be won. I mean, people are going to believe what they want to believe. There's the old saying, the people who need to hear don't listen, and the people who listen don't need to hear. There is an element of that. But going after, you'd say go after media or social media that present misleading or false information. I mean, that reminds me of Tom Cruise and A Few Good Men. I strenuously object. You're just going to draw more attention to it. You fight information with more information, in my view. And so you just have to do a better job of anticipating the enemy tactic and being prepared to respond to it more aggressively.
General Beidler, did you want to weigh in?
Add a point on this. One of the things we discussed when we were there in February was a lot of the focus on the messaging was on from messaging from Israel was on Hamas, what was going on in Gaza, and what they were doing relative to the enemy. One of the things they didn't talk much about was what they were doing to secure Israeli citizens in Israel. Focused back on what their obligation was to the citizens of Israel and taking care of those that were displaced and those that were harmed in the attack on 7 October. I think the other thing that they told us was they probably could have better anticipated that the disinformation campaign from Hamas was going to be strategic and overpowering, if not challenged, and then having a multitude of speakers at the military level and at the government level to talk about these things routinely, to put things in context. Over.
Thank you, General. So I know we are about to run out of time, and we have a lot more questions that we weren't able to get to. I apologize to those of you whose questions I was not able to pose to the task force, but please rest assured that these are conversations we'll definitely be continuing. Let me encourage you to read the report at jinsa.org. Even more importantly, share it. We certainly will be making sure that it gets in front of as many policymakers and journalists as possible. But let me use our last 2 minutes here to ask our task force for any final concluding thoughts or important messages that they want to make sure that the audience goes away with. So General Trask, maybe I can start with you.
Nothing to add to what my colleagues have already said, Blaze, but I do want to just thank JINSA for continuing to pursue efforts like this. I think this kind of gets to that last question. It is task forces like this, groups like this that are trying to educate the public and educate our leaders in the United States that can help make a difference in this in the future. But thanks. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you. General Beidler?
One of the things that I mentioned the other day, being a Marine Corps aviator myself, is that we never, as professionals in the service, target purposely innocents or friendlies. And when those accidents, those mishaps happen, we suffer as a result. I've spoken to many Marine colleagues, many of them recently, that still have repercussions of mistakes that were made, be it in Afghanistan or Iraq many years ago. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Professor Korn?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to piggyback on that. I think we have to be very careful. Countries don't commit alleged war crimes. Soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors. When you say that there are war crimes being committed without knowing all the facts, that's like saying 1 + I don't know = 10, and that person is immoral and illegal. And that's a lot to put on somebody. And I think that anybody who's been around the Israeli Defense Forces would reject the assumption that this is a group of warriors who has no feeling or compassion for the suffering of war. If anything, it's the exact opposite. They've been so close to it for so long that they understand that they're walking a tightrope. And I would be careful about what bothers me so much is how dismissive the international public seems to be on the efforts that this institution has made to try and avoid the suffering that is inevitable in war.
Thank you. General Wald, last word belongs to you.
No, I mean, I couldn't put it any better than the last three comments. I would just say this. I've been, just like my colleagues on here, we've been around the world. I think last count, I've been to 155 countries, been involved with dozens and dozens and dozens of militaries, both some operationally, some just interfacing. And I can honestly say, I guess I'm biased, but I don't think there's a more professional military force in the world than the IDF. And like Jeff said, every once in a while, people will make mistakes, and in a very rare occasion, actually do it on purpose, rarely. But I don't think anybody in the IDF right now today would do anything but try to do their best to be professional. And I admire them for it. And I feel for the country of Israel for what they have to go through, and for the military with this. It's a tough fight. It's not over. And we need to support them.
Well, gentlemen, let me thank you very much on behalf of GINSA for your participation, your hard work, the many hours that you put into this report. Let me thank all of those who tuned in. Thank you for watching. Again, I'd commend the report on our website at ginsa.org to all of you. Please share it, particularly with those who might have questions about what is happening in Gaza. And we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.